Hi, I'm Andrew, and this is Blaster Breakdown. Today I've got another Longshot build to show you. This is another remote line SPEX-BZ build, similar to the bolt action one you may have seen here. This time, however, I've incorporated a pneumatic piston, dual solenoids, an electronic pulse generator to deliver fully automatic fire, 6 darts per second at 300 FPS and above. Before we start though, if you haven't already, go ahead and subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to like if you enjoy my content. Alright, let's have a look inside. Okay, so I've made a good start with my first afternoon of work. Now the SPEX-BZ has the same outer diameter as the Longshot plunger tube, so it sits perfectly in the space where the plunger tube does without any need for shell cutting, so that's great. I've got that connected to my solenoid here. So this is a 3-2 solenoid in normally open configuration. And I can show you how that works by attaching an air supply. So it's normally open, which means the air is flowing through and the SPEX-BZ is currently pressurized. Now, in lieu of a switch, when I connect this, that will activate the solenoid to flip positions to be closed, and that will fire the SPEX-BZ, and you'll hear it go. And when I release, it pressurizes again. So I know that's working nicely. Okay, that's the easy part. Now, far more interesting is this pneumatic piston. These are available in a number of different sizes. So this has got a 50mm throw or extension between in and out. And I've connected it to the Longshot bolt sled by cutting off the plastic piece that extends kind of that far and made a little hole there, and you can see the end of this rod is threaded with a nut either side to hold it in place. Now, the channel in the shell here where that part of the original bolt sled slides is almost perfect in size to fit this piston. The only thing I needed to do was grind a little bit of space at the front here where this larger bit goes. And so I've got push fits front and back, and the air going in one or the other will control if the piston is extended or retracted. So that fits really nicely, as I say, in the shell there. And so the bolt sled will slide back and forth really smoothly. Now, to control that, I've got a 5-2 solenoid. And what this does is air comes in this port and goes out either one or the other of these outlets. Whichever one is not connected to the air coming in is exhausted to atmosphere. So through either of these ports, which I don't need anything in, that's just going to atmosphere. So again, if I connect my air coming in, and attach the front and the back here. Now this is just for show, of course I'll cut these blue hoses much shorter before I finish. But if I attach this, because the piston is back, that means the front connection has air coming through. So from here, when I change position, it'll swap to the rear and we'll see the bolt sled go forward. Again, just using this little connector in place of a switch. And there you see, so air's going in the back and the bolt sled is forward. And I release and it reverts back to the original position. So that's really as complicated as the pneumatics need to be. One solenoid controls the SPEX-BZ firing. A second solenoid controls the piston, pushing the bolt sled back and forward. On the opposite side of the shell, I just cut space for the second solenoid, so these will sit side by side inside the shell, and then I've still got a bit of space here for some other bits and pieces. So that's pretty much the pneumatics done and dusted. Next we've got the brass. So here's my 17/32 brass, and I'm going to glue the back of that into the front of the SPEX-BZ, and I've cut that so that the darts sit just so when the breech is open. To close the breech, I've got this piece of 9/16 brass that will sleeve over, and that's polished nice and smooth, so that sleeves over to close the breech. and that will be fixed into the bolt attachment piece, which I've drilled out with a 9/16 bit. So that will hold brass, and as that moves back and forward with the bolt sled, that will open and close the breech. Now, when the bolt is all the way back, as it is here, that's when I need this breech to be completely open. So about there. And when it's all the way forward, about there, that's where it will be closed. So my 9/16 brass doesn't follow exactly the shape of the plastic piece. It'll be as long as it needs to be. In fact, it's probably a bit longer at the front than it needs to be, but that's all right. So the next thing for me to do is glue the 17/32 brass through a small coupler piece into the front of the Spex BZ, and then glue the sliding 9/16 brass into the plastic bolt piece for attaching to the bolt sled. Okay, so I've completed my brass work now. Let me just explain what I've done. So I've got a length of 17/32 brass attached to the coupler piece at the front of the Spex BZ, running through to about here. And in that, I've just cut this opening for darts, so that the darts will fit just like so. And that's epoxied into the front of the Spex BZ using a small piece of 9/16 brass cut and glued inside one another. So 17/32 into 9/16 into the coupler piece at the front of the Spex BZ. So that holds this main 300mm section of 17/32 in place, and that's not going anywhere. The sliding bolt piece I've drilled out in the usual long shot way with a 9/16 drill bit going backwards. Then a piece of 9/16 brass is glued in. You can see how that's glued into here. So the whole thing moves back and forward. So again, the profile cut out around here matches the 17/32 brass. Again, it's cut for the dart to fit in, and it goes through to sort of about here. So when the breech is open, that much of the length telescopes. When the breech closes, we've still got a seal here, and now we've got a seal at the front as well. Now, the movement of the bolt sled is controlled, of course, by our piston back here. So the length of throw of this again is 50mm, and it worked out that was an excellent length so that when the piston is fully retracted, the breech is completely open. When the piston is fully extended, the breech is closed. So we've got a good air seal. So for short darts, for this size breech opening, 50mm has worked out perfectly. The only other thing I've done with the brass is extend the barrel. So that was about 150mm of effective barrel length. So I added another 200mm on the front. To do that, I glued a piece of 200mm 17/32 into a 250mm length of 9/16, and so that's sleeved and glued just over the last so much of this piece of 17/32. So the two ends, but about there, it's the clean finished end, so it's nice and smooth. And what that then allows is at the front here, where I'll have this exposed brass, this is now double thickness, 17/32 inside 9/16, so it's twice as thick and so less likely to bend or break if it gets hit against something. At the front, I've got a Blastertex scar, and one of the options these comes in is a 9/16 size. So that will fit over the end of the 9/16 with just a regular friction fit. So a couple of final things I need to do to hold this all in place. The dart gate and muzzle pieces and the barrel in between will go over this part. And what I'll do is put some duct tape around here and glue that into this piece. And so that'll hold that firm. So when that sits about there and goes in there, there'll be no movement going forward and back because the faux barrel piece is held firmly in the shell front and back, and the brass is held firmly inside the faux barrel. At the back here, you can see that the Spex BZ is not fixed in place at all. There's a bit of movement there. What I think I'll do is just put some epoxy putty underneath to provide a forward lip for the front of the Spex BZ to rest against, so it can't go any further forward. At the back, we've got this plastic molding, so it's not going to go any further back. I might also do the same to hold the piston in place. It's quite a firm fit as it is, but maybe a bed of epoxy putty or even just hot glue would provide a bit of additional stability so that it doesn't jump up with use. So that's the brass work done. The next thing I'll look at is the wiring, and we'll get to that pretty soon, I think. Okay, I'm really close to finishing this one now. Let me show you what I've done from the front. So the faux barrel has the brass glued inside, so that's firm. And I also glued the faux barrel into this front muzzle piece. Just drop some glue inside there. So now the brass won't move back and forth, but it also won't twist around. So I can ensure this breech piece won't ever twist and get misaligned. So I've screwed the muzzle piece in place there. The dart gate piece is just sitting in place. That'll just be held firmly by the shell when it's closed. And then the rest is as it was. Now I didn't end up using epoxy putty to hold the Spex BZ in place. What I did instead is use this 3D filament printing pen, essentially, that takes a bit of filament and heats it up and spits it out. And you can shape it however you like. And I basically drew a stopper at the front here and the same on this side of the shell to hold the Spex BZ in place so it won't shift back and forth. So that's a really clever suggestion. Thanks, James, for putting me onto this. I use the same thing to fit this switch at the front here. Now, this switch controls the Spex BZ solenoid so that when the bolt sled gets all the way forward, hits the switch, Spex BZ will fire because the breech is closed, and then release as it comes out. Again, I just drew a bed for the switch to sit on, and then also some reinforcement in here so that the bolt sled doesn't push the switch out of place. So I need it to be activated only when the bolt sled is at full extension, but I don't want to be whacking it out of place every time it gets hit. So a couple of screws into that filament hold this switch nice and secure. You can see the red and the white wires that are connected by this switch just run underneath this magwell piece and then underneath where the switch is and through this little channel here I made, double glued to hold them in place. I also drew a switch plate for the trigger switch. So this switch controls the piston solenoid, and that controls whether the bolt sled is forward or backward. The other thing I talked about was fitting the piston in place, and I've just got some glue in place so that shouldn't move back and forward when the system is under operation. You might see a bit of filament in there as well. I drew that around the little hex nuts that hold the piston into the bolt sled. So now that can go back and forth without worrying about the piston moving. I don't have to worry about the Spex BZ moving because it's anchored at the front with some filament, at the back just with the shell. So that part is all done. Now the hoses to the piston, front and back, I've cut those short. I did some shell work on the inside just to make some space for the hose to fit. And then here I've got a Y piece for the air coming in to go to both solenoids, Spex BZ and piston. So air comes in and it will split to feed both. And then this just runs to a 45-degree angle piece and a connector to the outside where my remote line plugs in. So that's the rest of the pneumatics taken care of. Now the electronics to control the system. Now, as we mentioned, the solenoid to control the Spex BZ is simple and straightforward. It's just a single switch. So when that's pressed, the solenoid switches from open to closed. That triggers the quick exhaust valve to dump the air out through the front. And when the trigger is released, solenoid opens again and the Spex BZ is pressurized, ready for the next shot. The complicated component is the 5-2 solenoid to control the piston. And to recap, when the system's at rest, air comes through into the front of the piston, so the piston is forced backwards and the breech is open. When the solenoid is activated, the front connection is exhausted to atmosphere and the pressurized air goes into the rear, and that pushes our piston forward, bolt sled forward, closes the breech, activates the Spex BZ, and then when the solenoid is deactivated, it goes back to rest. Now in a semi-auto configuration, I could just use this switch activating the solenoid and that's it. There'd be nothing more to it. But because I want to have full automatic fire, this is where a pulse generator comes in. So this is a cheap component that receives an input from, in this case, the trigger switch, and outputs to a little MOSFET that I've got here to enable the piston solenoid to be switched on and off at a much higher frequency than you could do just manually. It also allows pulses of electricity, that's the on and the off signal, to be specified very accurately down to millisecond precision, depending on your settings for this module. Now, if you've seen my Super Duper Prophecy build video, you'll see I've used one of these before in a SuperCore build. I'll put a link above and also in the description. What this module allows us to do is to control the frequency of the pulses, but also what proportion of each pulse the electrical signal is on versus off. So the frequency will be effectively how many shots per second while the trigger switch is held, and the duty cycle is the proportion of each pulse where the solenoid is on and the piston moves forward versus off and the piston moves back. So we want the on pulse to be long enough for the piston to move forward, activate the switch and the SPEXBZ to fire the dart, and no shorter than that. We want the off pulse to be long enough for the piston to retract, bring the bolt sled back and open the breech, and no shorter than that. If the on pulse is too short, then either the bolt sled won't reach this switch to activate the SPEXBZ, or potentially would begin retracting before the SPEXBZ has dumped the air and fired the dart. If the off pulse is too short, then the bolt sled may not retract fully, and if the breech doesn't open completely, the next dart may not load properly. If the on pulse is too long, then that doesn't really matter. The breech will just stay closed for longer. It will just slow down our rate of fire. If the off pulse is too long, that also won't matter. It will, again, just slow down our rate of fire because we'll have time in both cycles where the breech is either fully closed, not doing anything because the dart's already been fired, or fully open, and again not doing anything because the next dart is loaded ready to go. So let me show you how this is configured. It's currently set to 1 pulse per second and 50% on and off. So if you can hear, on, off, on, off, on, off. So 1000 milliseconds per second, 50% means each pulse is 500 milliseconds on, 500 off. If I bump this up to, say, 4 cycles per second, now each pulse is 250 milliseconds in total, and the on and off components of those are half that, so 125 milliseconds each. If I go up to 10 cycles per second, each pulse is then going to be 50 milliseconds on, 50 milliseconds off. Let me just drop back to, say, 4. Now if I change the duty cycle, say down to 20%, now again I've got 4 cycles per second, so 250 milliseconds per cycle. But because it's only on for 20% of that 250 milliseconds, the on pulse is 50 and the off pulse is 200 milliseconds each time. So I can use these settings to figure out, as I said, the shortest amount of time I need for the pulse to be on, to close the breech, fire the SPEXBZ, and off the dart goes, and the shortest amount of time I need the off pulse to be to open the breech for the next dart to load. Taking those two values together, that will tell me the total cycle time that I need to allow, and then as many of those that I can fit into 1 second will be the frequency that I need to set here. Okay, so let's connect our air and see how this looks. Now, again, at rest, the SPEXBZ is pressurized with air coming through from the 3.2 solenoid, which is normally open, and the bolt sled is retracted because the 5.2 solenoid has air coming through to the front of the piston. When I pull the trigger, we'll see the piston move forward. It should hit this switch, and we should hear the SPEXBZ dump air. See how we go. Looks pretty good. I can hear the air coming out here, so I know that the bolt sled is hitting this switch. And I think I had it set to 4 cycles per second, so let's see how it goes when I hold the trigger on. All right. Okay, so I'm happy with the movement of that. The last thing is to adjust my settings on the pulse generator until I've got the optimum open and close time, and that'll tell me the best rate of fire that I can get. So that's really good. Happy with this. I'll close up the shell. I need to put a XC30 connector on here for my battery, but then this one is pretty much done. Okay, so I'll just show you what I've done to finish off this blaster now. So there's my remote line in where it sits just on the outside, the right side of the blaster. And you can see the part of the stock where a spare mag goes in the original configuration is where I can access the electronics. There's the pulse generator, but I can also access the battery inside to connect or disconnect. So when I'm charging, I can just attach leads to this and charge the battery without taking it out of the blaster. That's good. This is the pulse generator. I've just used this 3-wire JST connector, female on that end, male on this end, so I can disconnect the whole thing if I need to. I can use it in a different blaster if I wish, or if I just want to put it somewhere to keep it safe. But when in use, that'll all tuck in underneath there, keep it nice and neat out of the way. I also plan on putting some heat shrink over this with a bit of Velcro, and I've got some Velcro on the inside here, and so that'll help, again, keep everything nice and snug inside here. Now, the settings for the pulse generator that I need, there's actually one variable I hadn't considered when I was initially talking about this. So to recap, we need the on pulse, which opens the piston solenoid to drive the bot sled forward. We need that to be long enough for the bot sled to go all the way forward, to close the breech, and activate the SPEX-BZ solenoid to fire the dart. And then we need the off pulse long enough to open the breech fully for the next dart to advance in the magazine, ready for the next cycle. There is a third parameter, which is actually a limitation of the solenoid itself. So when I was testing, I found there was a limit of 10 switches on to off and back again per second, which is 5 on-off cycles per second, 5 shots per second. I was actually able to squeeze a 6th cycle per second out of it. But if I used a higher frequency than that, then the moving piece inside the solenoid would oscillate back and forth and never actually fully open, fully close. So 5 or 6 shots per second is about the maximum. So 6 cycles per second is about 166 milliseconds per cycle. I've settled on 25% of that being the on pulse, so that's about 40 milliseconds for the bolt sled to move forward, close the breech, and fire the SPEX-BZ. And the balance of that, 120 or so milliseconds for the off pulse to open the breech. During that time, of course, the SPEX-BZ refills with air ready for the next shot. So 40 milliseconds gives me a nice snappy response when I pull the trigger, which is what I want. And 6 shots per second is the upper limit of what this 5.2 solenoid is capable of when driving that piston. So I'm planning on running this at 100 PSI. I'll get some numbers over the chronograph now. I might see how it goes at a bit higher than that, maybe 120 PSI, just out of interest. But my main aim will be events with a 300 FPS cap. Okay, let's get some numbers. Okay, let's get some FPS numbers. So starting at 100 PSI and Worker Red Gen 2s. Let's see how we go with 10. Now for a bit of fun, I'll bump it up to 120 PSI, see what we get. So a couple of outliers at the end there, didn't feed just right. I think 100 PSI is going to suit my needs just fine. Okay, here we are, 50 feet from the target as usual. I've got my Novarich red dot magnifying sight in place. Looks pretty cool, so I've set that to 2 times magnification, just because why not? So again, Worker Red Gen 2s. I'll do 10 semi-auto, and then we'll just do a mag dump for fun. Yep, that's a lot of fun, all right. So there you have it, a fully automatic HPA long shot, 6 darts per second at 300 plus FPS. It features Spectre's SPEX-BZ, a pneumatic piston, dual solenoids, electronic pulse generator, all housed in the stock. Please leave any questions and comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.